The ice looked like a single sheet of glass from the cockpit, shining up through a gray lid that pressed the horizon flat. The DC-10's nose tilted gently down as the captain eased the descent, the engines rolling back to a hum you could feel through the feet. Tourists on the left side craned for the promised blue ice and dark volcanic rock. Cameras nudged against windows already smudged by breath. A recorded guide pointed out the sights, Cape this, Glacier that, while a second commentator, flown down just for the trip, leaned forward to see past the angle of the cockpit frame. He'd been here before. He knew how the world could hide its edges. They were on a sightseeing loop from Auckland to the bottom of the map and back, a long day's arc that gave passengers the bragging rights of Antarctica without changing into parkas at a research station. Air New Zealand had run the flights for years. The routine was tight. Depart before dawn, cross thousands of miles of ocean, dip low along the ice to let people see the white continent, then climb and turn for home by afternoon. The crew briefed a plan that was as much theater as navigation. Descend when cleared by the American controllers at McMurdo, stay well clear of the high ground on Ross Island, and follow a route that bent around the volcano that brooded over the sea ice. The captain was a careful man, exact with checklists and polite on the radio. His first officer ran the numbers. The flight engineer watched fuel and pressures and the temper of 3 engines that had crossed the world many times. Each seat in the cabin had a chart tucked into the pocket with the day's route printed clean in black, a track line that aimed for open water in McMurdo Sound, curving around the island before skimming the edge of the continent. That line was what the pilots expected to fly. Overnight, on the ground far from the crew and the airplane, someone had opened a file and corrected a coordinate in the airline's navigation program. It was a small change, a pair of digits that moved the final waypoint a short distance on a globe so large it looked like nothing at all. On a local map, it meant everything. The new track no longer brought the DC-10 over the middle of the sound. It sent the jet straight down the axis of Ross Island, toward Mount Erebus. The morning began clean. A steady stream of coffee and warm food kept the cabin comfortable. Passengers pressed against the windows to catch the first sight of bergs, pointing out shapes in ice the way people point out animals in clouds. The crew listened to the American controllers at McMurdo Station, call signs laid over a radio that fuzzed and cleared with the geometry of a globe and the bounce of signals over ice. The clearance came to descend below the cloud deck for sightseeing, standard on these flights when conditions allowed. The pilots ran the checklist and brought the big airplane down in smooth 500-foot steps, watching the altimeter unwind. 10,000, 8, 6. Out the glass, the world offered no clues. Sector Whiteout, veterans called it, a trick of light and topography that erased shadows and welded sky to land. In those conditions, even a pilot who had walked on the ice could be fooled into seeing flat where there was a slope, open where there was a wall. The radar altimeter ticked up numbers that seemed to agree with the picture in the crew's minds. Still high enough, still safe above flat ice. The commentator peered ahead and said, almost to himself, that the conditions didn't look good. They expected to see the dark ribbon of open water of McMurdo Sound off the nose, the research station off to the right, and the smoking cone of Erebus far to the side where it always was on these flights. Instead, hidden in the haze, the mountain sat directly in front of them. The mouth of a broad glacier rose to meet them with a grade so gentle that to human eyes it might as well have been level. The white surface ran out and up and then simply became cloud. The airplane's black nose cut toward that seam. The cockpit voice recorder captured busy normalcy, altitude calls, small adjustments, a desire to drop a bit lower for the passengers because the view would be better if the layer would let them. The ground proximity warning sounded once and silenced. The nose came up a touch. It felt right. None of them were reckless men. They were doing the job as it had been done many times. Then the warning called again, urgent and electronic. "Whoop, whoop! Pull up!" The first officer's hand moved to the throttles. The captain eased back on the column, and the engineer looked up hard from his gauges to the slant of white ahead that was no longer an idea, but a surface coming fast. The commentator's last words were simple and soft, an observation that they'd gone down into a place that didn't want them. The DC-10 struck the ice at speed on the lower slopes of Erebus. The left wing dug first, the fuselage tore, and the forward section drove into packed snow with a force that turned aluminum and seats and people into one thing thrown in every direction at once. The engines ripped free. Jet fuel sprayed. Fire flared and guttered in thin air. The shock rolled across the mountain and settled into a white quiet that absorbed sound the way sea fog swallows a horn. There were no survivors. Back in New Zealand, families waited for the radio to announce the turn home. They had plotted the day against clocks on kitchen walls. The news came too slow, and then all at once. Contact lost. Overdue. Possible crash. By the time a search plane found the black smear against the white, wreckage speckling a slope thousands of feet above the sound, wives and husbands and parents already felt the shape of the truth forming in a place beyond words. Photographs taken from the air showed the tail broken clean and slabs of wing scattered like flung cards. A rescue team went in across the ice with Navy support from McMurdo, then by snowcat and on foot up the slope in cold. That was a thing you had to push against to lift your knees. Investigators from New Zealand and the United States faced a mountain that kept its distances even when you stood on it. They picked their way through the debris field, flags marking paths, plastic bags filling with anything that would later make sense on a table in a warm room, an altimeter face, a spool of magnetic tape, a page from a passenger's guide wrinkled and blown into ice. The cockpit recorder and the flight data recorder were found, scarred but legible. The tapes told a story that did not sound like thrill-seeking or bravado. It sounded like a crew walking down a procedure line by line, trusting a machine that was telling them where they were supposed to be. The first official report pointed to the men in the cockpit. It spoke of poor judgment, of flying too low for the conditions, of ignoring the warning voice that tells a pilot to climb and live. The country's grief twisted, suddenly given an object to strike. Then a second look, deeper and colder, broke the story open. A quiet programmer and a chain of managers had moved a waypoint on a screen without telling the pilots whose names would be carved into stone. The captain had briefed a route that would keep him clear of the mountain. The route in the airplane's navigation computer was different. When the crew lined up on the line they'd been given, they were lining up for a place no one had meant them to go. In hearings that became national theater, voices rose with the heat of reputations on the table. A judge listened, then wrote a finding that placed the weight where it belonged, on organizational failure, on a change made without full knowledge of its consequences, on the deadly mix of whiteout and trust in a line of digits that had always been right before. The airline pushed back. The public pushed harder. In the end, the verdict stood in all but name in the minds of those who cared. The pilots were taken down from the hook where they'd been hung. The dead were allowed to be mourned as victims of something larger than a single choice in a cockpit. Back on the mountain, crews worked through a season to recover remains and what could be carried down for families. The slope was steep and treacherous, the weather swinging from blue to blind in an hour. Men who had never been sentimental about their work stitched small flags into the snow to mark where they'd been and where they'd found someone. In cities across New Zealand, churches filled and emptied to the sound of names read in long lists, photographs on mantels turned into small altars. A mother touched a sleeve that still smelled of a closet and set her son's name into a room that had no answer to give. Airlines everywhere studied the findings. Briefings changed. Coordinate updates were made visible, not hidden in systems work. Descent procedures tightened near terrain. Crews were taught the tricks of light at the end of the world, and not to trust a flat horizon when the island under it could rise unseen. Engineers added logic to warning systems to make the machine shout earlier and louder when it suspected the picture in a pilot's mind had drifted from the truth. What remains on Erebus is a scatter that the snow tries to take back each year. On clear days, climbers who have earned their way high enough can still find small pieces: a twisted bracket, a hairpin turned red by cold and time, spilling from the slope like clues in a story that is already told. A memorial cross stands within sight of the crash site. In Auckland, another memorial holds a roll of names and the quiet of a room made for looking without talking. The disaster became a line in training manuals and a lesson in boardrooms, but for families, it is a day that never ends. They talk about the ordinary things the dead left undone: a pair of shoes by a door, a shopping list tucked into a wallet, the dent a pillow kept for a season, and then lost. They tell the story to their children, and then to their children's children, careful to keep the details correct, careful to be fair to the men who did their jobs and didn't come home because a number shifted in a place they couldn't see. If you stand on the edge of the Sound on a clear day and look up toward the long white shoulder of the volcano, it's possible to hold both truths at once: that the world can trick the eye, and that a single wrong coordinate can move a path just enough to make the difference between a safe descent and a final approach into stone. That is what happened here. It wasn't fate. It was a chain of human decisions, each small and reasonable on its own, that added up to a straight line toward a mountain hiding in plain sight. Thank you for listening to Road to Ruins. Subscribe for more true stories where systems fail and people pay the price.